Did it work?
Just, could you upload the thing when it's done?
Yeah, it does it automatically.
Yes,
When you end the session,
yes,
it will record it.
yes.
Yeah.
How are you feeling?
Good. It's so cute.
Well, hello. I'm glad to be back. I don't know how you feel. In any case, I'm grateful for your patience. Um, and I guess we'll have a little discussion now uh, about the course setup. The key date in all this is um, the 19th of January, which is the last day of class. There is, of course, the Christmas break, and then we resume, I think, on the 5th. The last day of class is the 19th. And then I think they mention sort of a very, very short examination period of 2 days. So that day, the 19th, will be the day that you need to submit your paper. Although, again, I would say that there's a possibility of extension. I can manipulate things, give you a little bit more time. And also, with the final exam, remember it was going to be a takeover exam, same format. 3 of 9 questions covering everything down to the last lecture that I gave, that I will be giving. And I will continue to be sort of reviewing, the review questions. We'll do the review questions as we develop the narrative of the lecture. So, and maybe I can give the take home, I can give out the take home a few days earlier. Why not? And so you'll have maybe 5 days to write the exam rather than 2. Are there any questions? Oh, I'm trying to let people in. I forgot how to do that. Does anybody remember how to do that? And oh yes, here it is. Yes, everybody got in now. Okay, I'm repeating this. I'm sorry I kept you waiting outside. In any case, the thing is that there will be the 19th is the critical day. That's the last day of class. And you will submit your essay on that date. Maybe I can give you 2 days more, something like that. The final exam will be distributed on the same day, the 19th, or maybe a few days earlier, because it's a take-home exam. And it will be 3 of 9 questions based on the review questions, which I'm developing as we go along, developing the narrative. Are there questions about this?
Sorry, just to clarify, our essay will be due the 19th, and our exam will be distributed either on the 19th or before the 19th.
That's right. That's right. Other questions? I have to thank you for your patience. And but I would say that there is a lesson in all of this, and that is that we do live in a representative democracy, and I stress representative democracy. It's a political democracy, representative democracy. But the reality is that everybody has a boss. Well, most people have a boss. Just as in the Middle Ages, they had a landlord. And fundamentally, nothing has really, well, I would say certainly the system has been mitigated, softened especially in the developed countries like Canada. But fundamentally, we're under the control of bosses. That's the way that's the reality not of the university, and it's the reality of all the other institutions and businesses in this society. That's the way it works. As I said, that regime has been softened, but that's the way it is. So that's the basic sort of political lesson. And I think that what I've said is important to your later life in terms of understanding the way things really work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the narrative. Let's have questions or discussion as you like, if we can. I'm going to pick up the narrative, and we'll take it as far as it goes. And I would say that in the next lecture session, I'm going to start with developing the review questions that we're on at the moment. I think there are 3 review questions that we need to zero in on, and I'll do that on Friday. And we should get pretty well close to, if not right to the end of the course, despite the strike. Are there any further questions? No further questions. Okay. Let's pick up the narrative in a general sense with the Tet Offensive, 1968. Clearly, this was the climax of the whole war. And as you'll recall, the Tet Offensive was launched by the NLF and the PAVN in response to the American escalation of the war in 1965, including the presence of over 500,000 American troops, ground troops. And as we saw, although it was very spectacular and so on, and lasted months, the Tet Offensive failed in its ultimate objectives. Its ultimate objective was basically to overthrow the regime and force the Americans out. Well, that didn't work. The communists suffered many casualties. General Tu remained in place, and the American Army certainly fought back, and certainly even elements of the ARVN fought well on this occasion. However, the real effect of the Tet Offensive was at home in the United States, because the offensive destroyed the credibility of the Johnson administration, and Johnson was forced out of office, as you saw, as a result. And of course, it also destroyed the whole policy of escalation. Johnson's own advisors, the so-called wise men, told him to de-escalate and disengage rather than to escalate. And so the politics changed even before Johnson left office. And so it was Nixon and his security advisor, Kissinger, who assumed the control of the American government at the beginning of 1969. And their policy was very different from Johnson's. It was looking for a step-by-step, a gradual disengagement. And by disengagement, I mean, first, the 2 elements of it were the so-called Vietnamization of the war, and secondly, what we call detente with the communist powers, that is to say, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. As for Vietnamization, basically what this came down to is the American withdrawal of ground troops from the conflict. The presence of these ground troops led to substantial casualties on the part of the United States, and it fueled the anti-war movement, amongst other things. Of course, the anti-war movement was by '68 was in the millions and millions in the United States. So withdrawing the ground troops was the basic change. But while American troops were going to be drawn down gradually, ARVN and the Republic of Vietnam's Air Force were going to be built up. And ultimately, there was a massive infusion of even more American military aid, and the ARVN grew to 1.2 million troops. Remember, the French had about no more than 300,000 troops. This is 4 times as many. The ARVN and I'm trying to admit somebody. Okay. The ARVN was going to be built up, and the Air Force was going to be built up. And furthermore, American air power in the region was also going to be built up from Thailand, from the aircraft carriers offshore, from Okinawa. The Americans were going to intensify the air war. And so, and the hope was the Americans would get out on the ground, but this degree of force would be enough to allow the Republic of Vietnam to survive. At the time in '68, you know, I was around certainly, and I thought, well, you know, this is the beginning of the end. And many people felt that way, but that's not the way Nixon felt about things. No, he wanted to save this enclave in Southeast Asia, and he was trying to do it through Vietnamization. I think it was it just gave the Americans a decent interval, we could say, because the other side was so strong. But in any case, this was Nixon's policy. Now, the other aspect of the policy was détente. That is to say, a diminution of tensions between the United States, Russia, and China. Things had to simmer down and so on. And this would allow, détente would allow the maintenance of what Kissinger referred to as the balance of power, and particularly the balance of power in Asia, such that whatever happened, whether Vietnam or the Republic of Vietnam survived or not, the Americans would not lose their place, their situation in East Asia. So that the Americans might disengage from Vietnam, but they were intent, and they still are intent on keeping their place in East Asia. And in general, from this point of view of the balance of power, on a world scale, the United States, despite the setbacks in Vietnam, was still the major power, was what we call hegemonic, and therefore preserving American dominance in the world was obviously a very important part of Nixon and Kissinger's policy. Now, that's the overview of the situation that I'm giving you. But what should be borne in mind from this point onwards is this whole question of détente, how it ultimately worked out. And how it ultimately worked out was that the Americans made certain concessions to the Soviet Union, and were looking to the Soviet Union to help them get out of this situation in Vietnam. but that didn't work. And so ultimately, the Americans turned to China. And it's this link up with China that is absolutely critical in terms of the long term. It created a completely new situation in Asia and indeed in the world, as we know, because ultimately, when agreement was reached with Mao Zedong and China in 1972, the Americans opened up diplomatic relations with China. They opened up American markets. This is critically important to Chinese goods. They even began on a gigantic scale to transfer manufacturing capacity to China from that point onwards. Could anybody explain to me why they did this? Does anybody have a sense of that? That's quite important.
Was this part of Deng Xiaoping's openness and reform
Yes,
policy when he took
absolutely.
place? When he
Absolutely.
went over to China, or sorry, he went over to US
Yes,
and he met with the current president over there, which was the first time any Chinese president met with any American president
Yeah.
since the CCP was formed.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah, he was trying to industrialize China a bit more, try to open it up to world trade.
yes. The Chinese were, from the Chinese point of view, opening the American and world market to what they were producing, and the infusion of American investment was a huge thing for China. That's the beginning of the real takeoff. But the Americans went there because they could make money selling into the Chinese market, but also the cost of labor in China was a fraction of what it was in the United States. So they could increase their profit margins dramatically, and they did. American corporations, as well as other Western corporations, made trillions, just huge amounts of money by investing in China. And so, and the world that we know in the last 40 years has been shaped by this relationship. So this is what we need to look at. Of course, it came to an end under Obama. This is when the troubles began, as we know, because the Americans began to fear, and legitimately, that the Chinese had grown too large, and furthermore, they had not, as the Americans expected, become capitalists. No, they reasserted their socialism, and so the Americans were very disappointed from 212 onwards. That's the story of the world. But all of this is critically important, and it emerges out of the Vietnam War. So you have to sort of keep your eye on this main line in terms of sort of understanding the underlying geopolitics. Of course, I'm giving you the details of the war and how it turned out, and the battles and what happened, not merely to Vietnam, but also what happened to the neighboring states of Cambodia and Laos, because terrible things happened in those countries, and we have to get into it. So are there any questions about this overview or discussion? This is the sort of grand picture here. And now we're going to get back into the nitty-gritty. Now, from the beginning of Nixon's presidency, his tenure, he understood that the United States had to get out of the ground war. They weren't going to they weren't leaving, the Air Force wasn't leaving, and they were going to back the Republic of Vietnam with lots of military and other support, but the Americans had to get out of the ground war. But the whole question was the pace of the withdrawal. If it was too hasty, it would look like an all-out cave-in, all-out and shameful defeat. And America would leave dishonored, and there would be no possibility of the survival of the South Vietnamese state. So American prestige was on the line. You'll notice that things have changed because the Americans precipitously pulled out of Afghanistan this year. Just overnight. But back then, this is a period when, the Americans had this incredible, this is like the British in their prime. The sense of their empire was extraordinary. Now, in any case, Nixon fought for years in order to prevent the Republic of Vietnam from falling apart, prevent American humiliation. And he started off by bombing Cambodia. In March of 1969, Nixon began to bomb Cambodia. The neighboring state came under huge bombing attack by the United States. He did this in secret. Does anybody know why? Suddenly he turns around and starts bombing eastern Cambodia with B-52 bombers. And, this horrendous bombing.
Is it
Why?
to disrupt like the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the supply lines leading into the
Yes,
south?
exactly. Yes, that's right. The supply lines from North Vietnam down to South Vietnam passed right through Cambodia. And the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail which was getting more and more developed. And furthermore, communist troops, PAVN and MLF troops had sanctuaries on the other side of the border in Cambodia. So Nixon ordered an all-out attack by B-52 bombers. And in addition, secretly, Green Berets and other troops were sent to raid the communist sanctuaries, the communist camps on the other side of the border. It's said that something like possibly as many as 1.2 million Cambodians died in these bombing raids. This was only the beginning, of course. Later on, it was the Khmer Rouge, but we'll get to that later. In any case, these raids began the process of destabilization in Cambodia. There's a lot of death and dying, and destabilization led. This began in March of 1970. Well, in 1969. In 1970, the ruler of Cambodia, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, was overthrown by an American-backed military coup in 1970. Sihanouk was extremely popular amongst the Cambodian people, but he was overthrown by a right-wing general in the Cambodian army who had the support of the United States. His name was Lon Nol. So the Americans destabilized by bombing, and ultimately they backed Lon Nol to take over and install a military regime allied with the United States in 1970. But of course, all of this, of course, far from ending the war, the communist troops responded to all this by simply retreating into the Cambodian jungle. They just moved westward, deeper into Cambodia to escape the bombing, and the war spread into Cambodia. And so the result of the bombing was that Nixon had widened the war. The war spread. Of course, this had happened to the French, remember, in the period from 1950 to 54. Well, the same thing happened when Nixon bombed Cambodia. It didn't improve the situation. The situation actually deteriorated. In any case, all of this was kept secret, or Nixon tried to keep it secret. But a certain professor who was working for the Nixon administration leaked the story, an American professor, to the New York Times, the leading American newspaper. published an account. And there was a massive response, hostile response from the anti-war movement. As a result, the whole thing blew up. Nixon was furious that he didn't know who had done it. And he ordered the FBI to begin an investigation, including wiretaps, pointing to members of his own administration to find out who was leaking this kind of stuff to the media. And then to boot, following this initial leak, in July of 1971, this is of course later, that's really 2 years later, really, the New York Times began to publish every day in the New York Times, there was an installment of something called the Pentagon Papers. And what was the Pentagon Papers? It was a massive secret history of the Vietnam War. Because McNamara, remember him, he was the defense secretary under Johnson who had initiated escalation. When by 68, they realized, McNamara realized, we're in a mess, we're stuck, we're in a quagmire. And then he turned around and asked his advisors, how did we get into this mess? He didn't know. And so he ordered the compilation of this secret history based on the secret documents of the US government of how the United States had actually become enmeshed in this quagmire. And one of the members of this group that actually published, who actually wrote this work, his name was Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg. He secretly, in the course of all this, from being an insider, from being a member of the establishment, he was radicalized by the war. And so he secretly began to Xerox copy the Pentagon Papers. And he gave this to the New York Times. It was published in the New York Times. This Ellsberg, Daniel, his name was, he was a Pentagon planner. And the book that he subsequently wrote, and we have in our library, it's called Secrets. You can read it. It's it's a fascinating account of all this. But Nixon's reaction to all this was, oh, these leaks, these crypto commies in my administration. And he ordered an intensification of government surveillance of people both in and inside his administration and outside. And he formed a special secret unit within the White House called the Plumbers, a group of about 40 or 50 men whose task was basically to undertake secret investigations, including wiretaps and break-ins, to find out who were the culprits, who were the ones who were basically squealing on the secret plans of the administration to the media. And this plumbers group began to operate. They secretly began to sort of break into people's homes and offices, and so to spy on them, wiretap them, and so on. And to a certain extent, it was effective. And so Nixon, who was a paranoid character, there's no doubt about it. Actually, Oliver Stone's movie called Nixon is an extremely good movie about this personality. He's a paranoid personality. In any case, Nixon gets the idea as in early 72, the election is coming up. You know, the Americans are always worried about the next election. So the election is in October. He tells the plumbers, well, go and find out the secrets of the Democrats. And so this group, with Nixon's permission, they go to the Democratic National Headquarters at night secretly, which is in an office building in downtown Washington known as Watergate. They break in into the Democratic National Headquarters, trying to basically steal the secrets of the Democrats. Well, the cops come and they arrest all these characters. About a little bit over 20 of them were arrested by the police. And Nixon tried to cover this whole thing up, that he had no responsibility, he said, for any of this. Well, an investigation was launched and ultimately it led to his impeachment and his resignation from the American presidency. He wasn't, in short, a self-destructive personality, was Nixon. But what's from a political point of view, of course, he was also made desperate by the fact that he could not really get out of the quagmire in Vietnam and the relentless criticism that was constantly by the anti-war movement against his administration, and that the pressure behind all this led him to desperate measures. Well, in terms of trying to get out, of course, he was pursuing Vietnamization, but in the first instance, he sent Kissinger to the Soviets to try and get them pursuing Détente. He offered them various deals on nuclear disarmament and so on. And he said, well, you have to help us out of Vietnam. Go to your friends in Hanoi and get them to basically agree to my policy. Well, the Russians laughed at Kissinger and the Americans because they were enjoying the predicament of the Americans. In the first place, the Americans were in a quandary. And secondly, as they told Kissinger, they couldn't do anything about it. Hanoi had its own policy. And there was no way that the Soviets could, the Hanoi policy was basically to win and to reunify Vietnam. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese had forced the Vietnamese communist leadership back at the Geneva conference to compromise. But the Vietnamese remembered that, and they absolutely refused. They had no interest in that. And moreover, by this point, the Chinese and the Soviets were at loggerheads. They were bidding for the support of Vietnam, and so the Soviets couldn't afford to offend the Vietnamese, and so that was not possible. That was not on. Getting the Soviets to somehow force Hanoi to compromise. Furthermore, and there was the peace talks were going on, of course, in Paris. Certainly, Hanoi was not prepared to withdraw its troops from South Vietnam, as the Americans had insisted since the beginning of the war. There was no way they were going to do that. They thought the country was one country. Why should they withdraw their troops? And as for Saigon and General Tu, he was very wary of Nixon's ideas about withdrawing American ground troops. He felt this made the Republic of Vietnam more vulnerable, which was true. And so he kept denouncing any plan for American troops to leave. Well, in any case, despite all of this, in May 1969, Nixon goes on American TV. His opinion polls began to deteriorate. He goes on TV and he tells the American public that the Vietnamese have to settle things between themselves, North and South Vietnam. He then, the next month, in June of '69, he flies to Midway Island in the Pacific and he meets General Tu. And he tells him, listen, Vietnamization is going to work. I'm going to back you to the hilt, but in order to placate American opinion, I have to begin withdrawing American troops. So this is in June. That's 6 months after he takes power. he announces the first withdrawal of American troops. 25,000 American troops are withdrawn. This was the beginning of Nixon's plan for Vietnamization of the war. And as I've explained, the Americans were step by step going to withdraw their ground troops. They were going to intensify the air war, and they were going to build up ARVN and the South Vietnamese Air Force. Now, of course, in the long run, this policy was a failure, but in the short run, it seemed to work in this sense that the beginning of the withdrawal of American forces led to a change in majority public opinion in the United States. Whereas up to this point, very strong majorities they wanted the United States to immediately get out of the war. That was American public opinion. But Nixon's action was reassuring. It was the beginning of the end. This had a pacifying effect on American public opinion. Up until this point, the left, the anti-war movement in the United States kept growing and growing. People were becoming more and more radical and so on. But the beginning of this policy pulled the fangs of the peace movement. From this point onwards, the peace movement, there were some ups and downs. The peace movement began to decline in the United States. And for good measure, Nixon announced that this strategy was part of an overall doctrine. Nixon had a view of the world. And he said from this point onwards, the United States would not become involved in conflicts in the third world. This would be true of Vietnam, but also anywhere else. Rather, the United States would simply build up and support allies in the third world and not get directly involved. And one should note that as a result of the fiasco in Vietnam, something called the Vietnam syndrome developed in United States politics. No politician from this point onwards, until Ronald Reagan came to power, could assert the idea that American ground troops should be introduced anywhere in the third world. This is known as the Vietnam syndrome. So over the next, basically, 20 years, so that's just the next 10 years or so, no American politician could suggest American ground involvement in any conflict in the third world. That only changed under Reagan, note. In 1983, Reagan invaded the small island of Grenada. I'm not going to get into the reasons. There were communists involved. And then in 1989, Bush sent American troops into Panama and removed the ruler of Panama, a man by the name of Noriega. And that was the beginning of the end of the so-called Vietnam syndrome. Because in 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Americans, of course, invaded Iraq in 1991. And from there on, they haven't looked back. They're everywhere. American ground troops are everywhere. So it took about 10 years to get over this fiasco, is what I'm saying. I moved ahead a little bit, but you should know all this. In any case, that was the way things were evolving from the American point of view. As for Hanoi, they were just involved in a waiting game. They affected to sort of negotiate at Paris and so on, but they were waiting the Americans out. The Americans are drawing down their troops. We will continue a low-level guerrilla protracted war, but we're not going to get involved in heavy combat. The Americans will leave, and when that happens, we will mount a serious military campaigns looking towards victory. But until then, we'll just wait the Americans out. Time is on our side. The American public is weary. We carry on the protracted war. And for that, their position was the Americans must get out. Two has to leave, let two resign. And they, the National Liberation Front, with the Agreement of Hanoi, created something called this is 69, the PRG, the Provisional Revolutionary Government. This was an alternative government for South Vietnam. Of course, there was the DRV in the north, but the Provisional Revolutionary Government was a provisional government basically constituted out of the NLF with the consent of Hanoi as an alternative to two. And Nixon at the table in Paris, he said, unless you stop invading the country, unless you agree with my terms, I'm going to intensify the bombing. And I might even invade North Vietnam. This is the kind of rhetoric that was coming out of Nixon. But it was all at an impasse. So what happened was, in August of 1969, there was a change in Paris because the peace talks had gotten going at the beginning of 1969, but they were fruitless from 69 until this time, 71, that the peace talks went nowhere. And so in August of 69, secret negotiations were set up in Paris, in a suburb. The formal peace meetings continued, but in fact, the real site of the action was in sort of secret negotiations that were carried on from August of 1969 until the final conclusion of an agreement between North Vietnam and the United States in January 1973. So it was a dual track. There were the formal negotiations, which were meaningless, a show, and then secret negotiations between August 69 and January 1973. Nixon soldiered on with Vietnamization. Meanwhile, the anti-war movement, in response to Cambodia and so on, staged the largest yet peace demonstration involving tens of millions of people, coast to coast, on the 15th of October, 1969. And what was significant about this event, it was the last really, I shouldn't say that, it was the largest peace demonstration. It seemed like the peace demonstration had revived and so on. But this renewed surge or wave of the peace movement was significant because for the first time, US troops in South Vietnam, I'm talking about the combat troops, they joined the demonstration. I'm not saying all of them did, but thousands of them that participated in this peace demonstration. I'll speak about that in a few minutes, but so Nixon had to do something. And so again, he went on TV. He appealed to the American public for patience. He said that Vietnamization was working. And the public opinion polls showed that Nixon had won the debate. Once again, the American public, fickle as it is, supported the president. And the peace movement was viewed by the majority as their peace demonstrations were prolonging the war, and Vietnamization was working. That was the view of the American public. I could say all kinds of stuff about the American public, or for that matter, the fickle nature of the Canadian public, but time necessitates I press on. Now, Vietnamization proceeded, but and the ARVN grew, and the military equipment of the ARVN and the South Vietnamese Air Force grew, but there was no improvement in the quality of the South Vietnamese military. It was just as it had been earlier. It was a hollow shell. At the same time, it also seemed that there was this military buildup, but the Americans also did succeed to a certain extent over a limited period of time of winning back significant parts of the land which had fallen to the communists at the time of the Tet Offensive. They suffered losses. The Americans used new tactics. They even got to introduce a land reform, and temporarily between 1969 and 1971, the Vietnamization, even in this respect, seemed to be working to a certain extent. However, from about early 1972 onwards, we could say that the communists, who had been lying low and they were basically rebuilding their forces, especially in the countryside. They were building more. They were building up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The PAVN was getting stronger, and from 1972 onwards, the communist side began to resume the offensive. Now, as this whole thing was unfolding and American troops were gradually leaving, one thing that did happen was the disintegration of the American military in South Vietnam, the ground troops. What we had in Vietnam amongst the American ground troops, over 500,000 troops, was, of course, some troops remained gung-ho, patriotic, determined, professional. They continued to fight, but the great majority of the American troops increasingly doubted the point of carrying on the struggle. After all, Vietnamization meant the withdrawal of American troops. So why should I get killed in this conflict? This had a fundamental effect on the morale of the American troops, but also the peace movement had its impact. The peace movement, also the Black Power movement in the United States, had its effect. Because although these troops in Vietnam regarded the peaceniks, the people who were against the war, as cowards and traitors, this is only natural. While these guys were fighting in the war, these people were protesting what they were doing. So the troops hated them. Nevertheless, the fact that millions and millions of people were opposed had its effects, and particularly because the troops in Vietnam realized that they came from the lower class. This was a conscript army based on the draft or the selective service. And lo and behold, the people who were called up were workers, Blacks and Latinos. And the white middle class was not, was present, but in a great minority. The people actually doing the fighting were from the underclass, and they were furious. So what were they fighting for? For wealthier people. They didn't want to do that. Furthermore, the quality of the American troops declined. The ROTC, the recruitment mechanism for officers, completely broke down. It depended on the presence of these recruiters on the college campuses. Well, they chased off the college campuses. The military lost its presence on the college campuses. So they had to promote people from the rank and file into the offices. And these people didn't have the same level of education as previously. So the quality of the officers And furthermore, there was growing tension between the officers, such as they were, the professional soldiers, and the conscripts. Why should I die? Was the attitude in this situation. The conscripts increasingly basically defied. Some of them joined the peace movement. They were openly, they became, they grew their beards, they carried peace signs, they were insubordinate to their officers, and they actually forced when they were sent out on patrol, the conscripts told the officers, listen, we're not going to go where the enemy is. We want to go in the other direction. They forced the officers to basically patrol in areas where the conscripts knew that they would be safe. And in 1969, there were reportedly 70 murders of officers by the troops in the field. And in 1970, that number doubled, more than doubled. Furthermore, there was a growth of racial tension. The Black soldiers, responding to the situation in the United States, began to fight with the white soldiers. And actually, would you believe it? They actually had gunfights that lasted several days between these black and white troops. Finally, there was a lot of the people who simply deserted, fled the military, fled to Canada, but also in Saigon itself. There were thousands of deserters living in Saigon and defying the American military. Some even joined the National Liberation Front. 70 American soldiers are reported to have joined the communist side during this interval. And finally, there was the drug problem. By this point, 1971, something like 15% of the American armed forces were using heroin, which was readily available in Vietnam and Laos and so on. 15% were basically addicted to heroin. And when they were they were sent home, they were released from the army as heroin addicts. So what I basically am saying that the American army began to disintegrate. And the result was that Nixon had to accelerate the withdrawal of American troops, as we'll see next time.